Have you ever felt like the tiniest gesture you made, one you barely remembered, might have lived on in someone else's heart forever? Sometimes, what we consider a fleeting moment of decency can echo through another person's life like a bell rung softly in the dark. Tonight, I want to tell you a story, a quiet story, one that slipped beneath the noise of the world but carried the kind of strength that changes everything. In the ceaseless rhythm of St. Mary's Medical Center in El Paso, Texas, a place where antiseptic lingered in the air and machines hummed like lullabies of survival, worked a woman whose name rarely appeared in bold letters or official memos. Isabella Cruz. Just 26, she moved through the hospital's maze-like corridors not with haste, but with grace. Like a breeze through curtains at dawn, she believed something radical. That gentleness wasn't weakness, but a form of courage most people were too scared to wield. Isabella had grown up learning that silence was protection, that speaking too much or standing out too far meant inviting judgment. She blended into the background, steady and silent. Her co-workers saw her as competent, trustworthy, and endlessly reliable. But behind that composed exterior lived a secret, a gift unshared, a heritage locked away. Isabella was fluent in Spanish, as fluent as she was in English. Her words in both languages could flow like river currents, smooth and intuitive. Yet she had never once used Spanish in the hospital. Why? Fear. The kind of fear that doesn't shout, but whispers constantly. You don't belong. You'll be misunderstood. You'll be seen as less. It was safer to keep that part of her locked up, tucked behind professional smiles and polite nods. Each day she passed portraits lining the hospital's walls, serious men and women, none of whom looked like her. In the center, hung larger than life, was Ethan Blaine, piercing blue eyes, an expression carved from granite. CEO of Blaine Care Corporation, the conglomerate that owned not just their hospital but dozens more across the country. To Isabella, he was nothing more than a face in a frame, a man from a universe far beyond hers. But fate has a way of ignoring distances. It was a Tuesday night in October. The ER swelled with chaos after a brutal multi-car accident on I-10. Isabella, though wary, wore her scrubs like armor. Her hair was pulled into her signature bun. She found solace in these in-between hours, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, murmuring comforts that settled into patients' dreams. In those quiet interactions, her voice felt braver, her presence stronger. But that night, something pierced the routine. From the family waiting area came a cry that sliced through the sterile air. Not a whisper of concern, but deep, guttural sobs. A mother unraveling in despair. Isabella froze. She heard rapid Spanish tumbling through tears, urgent, panicked. She didn't just hear the words, she understood every one. A mother, frantic, asking over and over about her child, who had just been rushed into emergency surgery. No one had answered her. No one could. In that instant, Isabella felt the tight grip of old fear return. Her secret, her language was being summoned, and stepping forward would mean shedding the invisibility that had kept her safe. To speak now meant exposure, vulnerability, and a courage she hadn't dared to test. Her heart pounded, her palms dampened. There in the corridor she stood suspended in time, like a tightrope walker between two worlds. She could walk away and remain the dependable, quiet nurse no one ever questioned, or she could step into the light and offer what only she could give. The stakes weren't abstract. They were raw and human and pulsing with real-time pain. Then something stirred in her. Not fear, but a memory. Her grandmother's voice, faint but resolute. Dios nos da dones para compartir, no para esconder. God gives us gifts not to hide but to share when the moment calls. Isabella blinked back the tears threatening to surface. Through the glass she saw the woman, small, crumpled in the corner of the room, consumed by loneliness in a crowd that couldn't reach her. A security guard was moving toward the mother, unsure, probably meaning well but unequipped. The divide between language and compassion yawned wide. And Isabella knew. This was her moment. With every heartbeat, she was shedding the quiet shell she had lived in for so long. What she did next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was brave beyond measure. And it would change everything. With a sigh of exasperation, the attending physician turned on his heel and walked away, shaking his head like a man who had given up trying. Even the social worker stood frozen, hands lifted in a gesture of helpless surrender. It was in that fractured moment that Isabella saw something beyond herself. This wasn't just about speaking a second language. This was about building a bridge where no one else could. It was about understanding that healing isn't always administered through medicine, but often through connection. This was about stepping out of the shadows, choosing to be seen, not for recognition, but because someone else desperately needed her too. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed her scrubs and inhaled deeply. Every step she took toward the waiting room felt like wading into a tide stronger than herself. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, and fear gripped her like cold iron. Yet she moved forward. Because bravery, she realized, was not the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done while afraid. At precisely 2:17 a.m., under the stark glow of St. Mary's fluorescent lights, Isabella Cruz knelt beside a woman shattering under the weight of the unknown. "Señora," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Ma'am, I'm Isabella. I'm a nurse here. Can I help you?" It was as if the woman had been underwater, and Isabella's words were the first breath of air she'd tasted in hours. Her tear-streaked face lifted, eyes wide with disbelief. "Habla español?" she asked, her voice fragile with hope. "Sí, señora," Isabella replied gently. "Please, tell me what happened. I'm here to listen." And so Maria Gonzalez, a hotel housekeeper with calloused hands and a mother's unyielding love, poured her soul out. Her 8-year-old son Diego had been hit by a car while riding his e-bike near their apartment. The paramedics had acted quickly, but no one had explained what was happening, how severe his injuries were, or even if he would survive. Isabella didn't just hear the words, she absorbed the pain behind them, the fear that had carved itself into Maria's voice, the maternal instinct roaring beneath every sentence. And then, with a grace that only comes from empathy, Isabella began to explain. She spoke of the surgical team's expertise, the procedures, the meaning of the blinking machines, not in cold clinical terms, but with warmth and reassurance. She stayed. She held Maria's trembling hand, and she told her over and over that she was not alone. What Isabella didn't know was that she was not alone either. 3 floors up, in the dimmed glow of the administrative observation deck, Ethan Blaine watched. He had arrived for one of his unannounced nighttime inspections, a habit meant to keep hospitals honest, to see how they truly functioned when no one expected oversight. Ethan prided himself on metrics, on efficiencies and performance charts. But what he witnessed in that quiet moment wasn't a statistic. It was something ineffably human. He saw the breakdown first, the irritation, the barriers, the institutional silence, and then he saw Isabella, the quiet nurse, with the quiet courage. He leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. She moved like gravity pulled her toward the heartache. He watched her kneel, speak Spanish, soothe the air around Maria like balm on an open wound. In that single exchange, the waiting room transformed. Despair thinned into hope. For 45 minutes, Ethan stood rooted in place. He watched Isabella explain, comfort, reassure, without any script, without any obligation beyond a moral one. And something inside Ethan stirred, something long dormant. It was as if the layers of bureaucracy he had wrapped around himself for years suddenly peeled away, exposing the raw truth. Hospitals were not just businesses. They were sanctuaries of humanity. But compassion, it seemed, came at a cost. The next morning, Isabella was summoned into the office of Linda Morrison, the director of nursing, a woman known for her rigid adherence to protocol. Her voice was crisp, professional, distant. "Miss Cruz," she began, hands folded neatly on the desk. "I understand you were involved in an incident last night." Isabella's stomach sank. "Yes, ma'am. I helped a patient's mother understand her son's condition." "That's the issue," Linda interrupted. "You're not certified to interpret. What you did, though well-meaning, created liability." The words stung like ice water. Isabella had expected maybe a nod of gratitude. Instead, she was being punished. She was terrified, Isabella said, her voice barely audible. She needed to know. "We have procedures for these situations," Linda said, her tone stiff. "What you did could have compromised patients' safety." Heat flushed Isabella's cheeks. "I was careful. I only told her what I knew." "That's not the point," Linda snapped. "You acted outside your scope. This will be a formal warning. Another incident like this will have consequences." As Isabella walked back to her station, her hands trembling, she felt something unfamiliar. A rupture between right and rule. She had always believed that safety came from compliance, but now she wondered if compliance had its own hidden dangers. All afternoon she went through her duties mechanically. Doubt clouded every movement. Had she been foolish? Had she done more harm than good? The shame was suffocating. But just as she was about to leave, the tide shifted again. 3 days later, while sitting alone in the cafeteria, Isabella looked up to see a man in a tailored suit approaching. She recognized him instantly. Ethan Blaine. The portrait from the corridor had come to life. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you Isabella Cruz?" Her heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. She was going to be fired. Her act of kindness had climbed too high up the chain. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I'm Ethan Blaine. Would you mind if I joined you for a moment?" Isabella nodded, barely breathing. Ethan sat, and for a heartbeat they just looked at each other. Despite his impeccable appearance, she saw weariness in his eyes, a kind of exhaustion not born of work, but of disconnection. And what he was about to say would change everything, again. Despite his polished appearance, there were signs that even Ethan Blaine, the man whose portrait loomed over the hospital corridors, was carrying more than the weight of corporate decisions. Shadows under his eyes, lines etched into the corners, spoke of sleepless nights and burdens too personal to share. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. Isabella blinked, confusion softening her expression. "Thank me?" "For what you did the other night in the waiting room with Mrs. Gonzalez." A flush of embarrassment crept up her cheeks. I was told what I did was inappropriate, that I overstepped." His jaw tightened, a barely visible sign of disapproval. "You were told that helping a terrified mother understand what was happening to her child was inappropriate? I'm not a certified translator. I could have caused problems." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. When he did, his voice held a gravity she didn't fully understand. "Do you know why I was at the hospital that night?" Isabella shook her head. "I do these surprise visits to see how things really work. Not the reports, not the boardroom talk, but the truth. That night I was preparing to write up notes on communication failures, inefficiencies. I was thinking like an executive." He paused, eyes clouding over. "Then I saw you." He met her gaze, and she saw it. Something raw, something unguarded. "I watched you step in when no one else would. I watched you create a moment of humanity inside a machine that had forgotten how. And I realized, his voice dropped lower, that I had forgotten too. A beat passed. Can I tell you something? Something I've never shared with anyone. Isabella nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. When I was 16, I was in Mexico with my father. A business trip. He was teaching me the ropes, preparing me to take over one day. On our way back from a meeting, it started to rain. The road slicked up. We crashed. The car flipped. My dad, he was hurt badly. Ethan's hands, until then resting calmly, clenched into fists. We were taken to a hospital, but my Spanish, it was terrible. High school level. My dad was conscious at first, trying to say something important, but the doctors didn't understand. I couldn't translate fast enough. He kept getting more agitated, more desperate. Isabella felt her chest tighten, tears brimming. She saw not the CEO, but the boy he had once been, helpless, grieving. He died that night. I never found out what he was trying to say. Maybe it was something medical, maybe he wanted to say goodbye, or that he loved me. I'll never know. The cafeteria around them faded into irrelevance. The noise, the clatter, all dissolved under the weight of Ethan's confession. "I'm so sorry," Isabella whispered. "That night, watching you with Mrs. Gonzalez, I kept thinking you were the person I wish had been there for my father. You were the bridge we didn't have, and instead of being honored for it, you were punished." He leaned forward. "That's when I knew our system is broken. We've built a fortress of policies so thick we've lost sight of the people we're supposed to serve. We need fewer walls, more bridges." The long breath. Then the turning point. "I want to offer you something," he said, voice steady again. "But first you need to know. This isn't charity. This isn't guilt. This is recognition. Because what you did, we need more of it. Everywhere." Isabella held still, heart pounding. "I'm establishing a foundation, the Blaine Community Bridge Foundation. It will provide free healthcare services, translation, and advocacy for Spanish-speaking patients who get lost in our system. I want you to run it." His words hung between them like stardust, impossible yet dazzling. I don't understand. I'm just a nurse. I don't know how to run a foundation." "But you know the most important thing," he said softly. "You see the invisible. You lead with compassion. Everything else we can figure out." "But why me? There must be people more qualified." Ethan smiled, a rare, unburdened smile that softened every edge. "Because 3 nights ago you had a choice, and you chose right. You stepped into the storm with no umbrella. You helped a stranger with nothing to gain. You used a gift you'd hidden to heal someone else. And maybe you understand better than anyone what it feels like to have no voice." The moment trembled in silence. Isabella stared at him, her identity unraveling and reshaping all at once. For years, she had believed she was too small to matter, too quiet to lead. But now, someone was telling her she could be more. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Ethan replied. "That means it matters. The things that scare us the most are usually the ones that change us the most." "What if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough?" You knelt beside a woman at her breaking point and gave her hope. "You're already strong." Isabella studied him. This man who had once seemed unreachable, now made human by grief and vision. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Poor feeling. "Why are you really doing this? What do you get out of it?" His answer came quietly, reverently. "Maybe a way to honor my father. Maybe a way to make something good out of the worst night of my life. Maybe a way to become the kind of man he would have been proud of." And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just about her stepping into courage. This was about both of them choosing connection over fear, healing over hiding. "When do we start?" she asked. 6 months later, the Blaine Community Bridge Foundation opened its doors. The building, a transformed warehouse in East El Paso, was full of color and comfort. Murals by local artists celebrated family, culture, and unity. It felt less like a clinic and more like a haven, a place built not from fear of liability, but from love and the courage to speak up when it matters most. Families could wait without feeling like burdens, without fearing that their presence disrupted the sterile flow of a medical institution. The foundation was more than a physical space. It was a sanctuary. Here, speaking Spanish wasn't a hurdle to overcome, but a bridge to connection. Here, questions were welcomed, not brushed aside. Fear was replaced with clarity, confusion with trust. In those early months, Isabella wrestled with doubt like a second skin. Her first television interview left her breathless and blushing. She froze mid-sentence during her first public speech, her voice trembling with anxiety. Nights were long, filled with self-doubt and quiet tears, but in each stumble she remembered Ethan's words, that she understood something most people didn't, how it felt to be unseen. That understanding became her compass. The foundation's first true victory came full circle. Maria Gonzalez, once broken with fear, now stood tall as one of its most passionate volunteers. Her son Diego had not only recovered but thrived, and Maria, filled with gratitude and grace, guided others through their own storms. "You saved more than my son that night," she told Isabella, her voice thick with emotion during the Foundation's 6-month celebration. "You saved my hope." What Isabella had built was not just a clinic, not just a program. It was a quiet revolution. Word spread quickly through the Latino community. There was now a place where voices weren't lost in translation, where dignity was restored, where fears were held with compassion. But the transformation wasn't just external. Isabella herself had changed. Visibility, once her greatest fear, became her source of strength. She learned to speak without apology, to lead without shrinking, to wield her gentleness as a force of real, grounded power. Her story became an anthem for those who thought kindness made them weak. And Ethan changed too. In watching Isabella grow into her power, he found a calling that stretched far beyond quarterly reports. Through her, he rediscovered his father's deeper legacy. Not business acumen, but humanity. Their partnership surprised even them. She brought soul and story. He brought structure and strategy. Where she created trust, he created opportunity. Together they created transformation. One evening, as they worked late, reviewing grant applications, Ethan looked up to find Isabella lost in thought, eyes on the darkened city beyond the window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled. "That night in the hospital, I remember how scared I was, how small it felt at the time. But now I know. That moment changed everything. It was the first time I believed my voice mattered." She turned to him. "Do you ever think about it?" "Every day," he said. "That night reminded me why I became a doctor, before I traded scrubs for spreadsheets." "You were a doctor?" "Emergency medicine, for 3 years. I loved it. But when my dad passed, I thought I had to take over, that it was the only way to honor him. Now I think maybe honoring someone means becoming the person they hoped you would be." Silence fell, warm and unhurried. Two people not bonded by romance, but something more enduring, understanding. The foundation became a blueprint. It was replicated in cities across the country, from California to New York. What had begun with one nurse's quiet bravery became a movement that reshaped care for immigrant communities. But the truest impact was personal. Isabella no longer hid. She became a lighthouse for the lost. Her quiet heart had found its roar. And Ethan? He learned that leadership didn't mean control. It meant service. That healing wasn't just clinical. It was human. In the Foundation's lobby, a bilingual mission statement was proudly displayed. Every person deserves to be heard, understood, and cared for with dignity. Language should never be a barrier to healing. But Isabella carried her own mission, carved silently into her soul. Kindness is not just something we give. It is something we become. Years later, when people asked her about the night everything changed, she would smile and say that courage rarely shouts. It doesn't seek applause, it shows up quietly, consistently, when nobody's watching. Real courage, she would say, is using your gifts to serve others, even when you're afraid. It's choosing someone else's need over your comfort. It's believing that even the smallest act of love can reach beyond what you can see. And when people asked Ethan about his transformation, he always gave the same answer. She reminded me that strength isn't building walls, it's building bridges, and that the most powerful question we can ask isn't, "What can I get?" but, "What can I give?" Through trust, not force, through vulnerability, not armor, Ethan learned that the right act of kindness can change an entire system. Because sometimes those who seem to need compassion least are the ones who need it most. And sometimes, when we step forward to help someone else, we discover our truest selves, waiting at the edge of that choice. In a world too often divided by language, culture, and misunderstanding, Isabella's story reminds us that our hearts speak a language deeper than words, that we all long to be seen, heard, and loved. The real question isn't whether we can make a difference, it's whether we will dare to try. If Isabella's story touched your heart, I hope you'll carry its message forward. Subscribe, share, and stand with us in choosing kindness, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet revolution. Because the most beautiful changes in this world happen not through noise, but through one brave, loving choice at a time.